All right, so I have some good news and then some bad news and then a little bit more good news. The part one videos, the check-in videos that we've been doing, after today, they're going to start getting a little bit shorter, sometimes a lot shorter. That's the good news. The bad news is the part two assignments are going to get quite a bit longer and a little more rigorous, and that's because these are going to become your projects or your assessments. Back to more good news, you're not going to have a part two every single day. Sometimes you'll have a part two and that'll cover 2 or 3 days in a row. So it's not going to be a ton more work. It's all going to be pretty easy. It's just probably going to be formatted a little bit differently on some days now that things are starting to settle down. So on Friday, what's going to happen today is you're going to have this video, and then you're not going to have a second video. You're going to have a short story, and you're going to be reading that across today, tomorrow, and Monday. So tomorrow, we are going to have an optional video conference during class. I will be online to talk about the story, explain the story, answer any questions you have. And if you can't log into video, you can always log in and type. That's just fine. And then on Monday, we're going to have a mandatory video conference for the whole class where we're all going to talk a little bit about the story, and I will explain even more about the story to you. So that's where we're at work-wise. Where we're at class-wise is we've just finished talking about Phillis Wheatley and Philip Freneau, two early American poets. Wheatley, the slave who became a poet, but wrote such great things about America, the country that kept her enslaved. And Philip Freneau, who never quite had the success that he thought he deserved, but wrote so much about the revolution. He took part in the revolution, and he wrote about such distinctly American things, and he was one of the earliest people to do so. But we still have this lack of a real American culture. There was culture, obviously, but it was culture that was still the European culture that we were just kind of using here in a way. We haven't developed our new independent American culture just yet. We have very little literary tradition. Most of the writing at this point up till now had been based in religion. Had been very heavily religious. There was not a ton else. There were other things, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the kind of stuff that people were buying to read. And it was definitely not stuff that they were reading in Europe. So most of the stuff that we were reading in here, reading in the United States, we got from Europe. We were bringing art and culture in, not sending it out at this point. And then we have a guy who kind of starts to change that. And his name is Washington Irving. So Washington Irving was born in New York City, right around the same time that news of the Treaty of Paris reached New York. So the war was ending / over, and Washington Irving is born as an American. Okay, so he was born in a free country, born in the United States of America. Remember, Phillis Wheatley and Philip Freneau were not. Freneau was born in this country, but it wasn't the United States of America yet. Wheatley was born in Africa, and she was kidnapped and brought here. Washington Irving is born as an American citizen. All right, it is a very important distinction to make at this point. So he's born after the war. He is named after George Washington. All right, Washington Irving. It's not a coincidence. There were a lot of children named after George Washington at this point. Many of them were named George, though, not Washington. So Washington Irving had that going for him. In fact, when he was a young man in New York, his nanny or maid or whoever it was actually introduced him to General Washington. Said, "Oh, this boy, he's named after you." And I'm sure Washington was kind of like, "Well, lots of babies are named after me." His family has money. They're very successful. But at some point, when he's still a young man, they lose that money. They start to have problems. They're about to go bankrupt. So knowing that he can't really make that kind of money here, Washington Irving picks up and he moves to Europe. So he moves actually to England at one point. The place we had just fought a war to get away from, that's where he goes. Because he knows he's a chance at saving his family fortune there. And if he's not able to save the family fortune, at the very least, he's a chance of making a living as a writer there. He goes, he writes fiction. He's writing short stories for the most part. and he's the first really successful American fiction writer. One of the only ones that makes a very good living selling these stories. He makes so much money selling his stories that he's able to come back to the United States and continue to write here. Again, like I said, most art and literature comes from Europe and ends up here. In Washington Irving's case, the literature started here and it went to Europe. And he was so successful in selling his work that most authors would publish in Europe, and then a year later maybe they would publish here. If they were successful in Europe, it would definitely come here. If they were publishing here and they were successful, maybe they would try and send it to Europe, maybe they wouldn't. Irving realizes that he's so successful publishing here in America that if he waits, people are going to steal his work and sell it in Europe. So he's one of the first American authors, in fact, the first American author to publish his work simultaneously in America and in Europe so that he can make money off it. It's a pretty good reason. And he is really the single most important person in establishing our literary tradition as being something that the Europeans, even if they don't respect it, they want to pay for it. All right, so they're interested in it. When he comes back, he's a bit of a celebrity. He's friends with authors like Oliver Wendell Holmes and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. You don't realize it, but you know Longfellow. He wrote the Dante's Inferno translation that many of you read last year. He wrote the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the poem. You guys remember that one, right? He's also friendly and hangs out with Martin Van Buren, who was the 8th president of the United States, and who Van Buren Ave, the street that the school is now on, that's who it's named after. So, two of his most enduring stories are that of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. And these are both stories that he took elements of it from the European tradition. All right, so they're popular stories. They are fictional stories. They have a lot of connections to European folk tales. In the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, we have the Headless Hessian, not Haitian, Hessian, the Headless Hessian, who we know is the Headless Horseman. And there were stories of Headless Horsemen terrorizing people in European folklore for centuries. He does incorporate a lot of local features. He kind of puts an American stamp on what could be a European story. If you go up to Tarrytown, New York, you're going to find places mentioned in the story like the Old Dutch Graveyard at the Old Dutch Church, the Mill Pond at Phillipsburg Manor. These are all things that are still there. There's a highway that runs in between them now, but they're still there. You'll also find the grave of a young woman named Katrina Van Tassel, and she was the inspiration for the character of Katrina Van Tassel in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's the woman that both Ichabod Crane and Brom Bones have feelings for. And if you stood at Katrina Van Tassel's grave in the Old Dutch Churchyard and you looked up the hill, you would see the grave of Washington Irving, because of course he used a place that he was intimately connected to set this story, because that was America to him. In Rip Van Winkle, we have geographic features, a region like the Hudson River Valley, the Catskill Mountains where Rip goes up the mountains to sleep. And he even takes a historic figure, Henry Hudson. Hudson River is named after him. He's a famous explorer. Henry Hudson, a guy with local ties in the story, or local ties in reality, and he makes him and his sailors into characters with some kind of supernatural influence in the story. So he's taking these old world traditions, and these aren't the old world traditions that we brought with us as colonists necessarily. It's not these things that were kind of forced on us as part of our common bond with Europe. We're not being forced for the spirit tradition. We're choosing to make it our tradition, and that makes a difference. And it's not like we're just taking like what they're forcing or what they're leaving us. We are breaking in the middle of the night and we are stealing these ideas. And what's more, we're showing back up in the morning at the front door and trying to sell them back to Europe. And that's what makes Washington Irving so special, and is that he is taking these ideas, making them an American, and then selling them back to the snobs in Europe at a profit. What is more American than that? So today, you're going to start reading Rip Van Winkle. It is in a doc attached below part 2, This Head Puzzle. There is a sheet for you to take notes on. There is a assignment explanation. There will be more explanation tomorrow, and I will be available during the class period via a Zoom stream, or Zoom meeting, so you can pop into that meeting and we can talk about the story and we can talk about the assignment, and you'll have a little time to work on it this weekend. So as we read Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, I want you to think about America. I want you to think about how this story connects to the revolution, how it connects to the idea of this new America that Washington Irving is growing up in, and how it becomes an American classic.